Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Set Lusting Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. We are getting off the Bruce train, but tonight we are here to discuss a lost writer, Peter David. So, Keith, welcome to the podcast. I wish it was under better circumstances.
Thank you.
Yeah. Peter David was when I mention favorite writers, he is on the top of the list. And so I know he had been fighting illness for a while.
Yeah.
So it was sad news, but not necessarily surprising news. But before we get to that, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
I'm a writer like Peter. Peter and I, in fact, were in many of the same literary circles. I write fantasy, science fiction, horror, comic books, superheroes, mysteries, also nonfiction about various bits of pop culture. Like Peter, I've written a lot of Star Trek fiction, and I also write about Star Trek for a variety of sources, mostly Reactor Magazine, which formerly was Tor.com. I've written in over 30 different licensed universes, from Alien to Zorro. I like to use the alphabet whenever I can,
Yeah.
including TV shows, movies, comic books, role-playing games, video games, etc., as well as my own original work. I've got a new series debuting this October called Supernatural Crimes Unit NYPD, which is about a division of the New York Police Department that handles crimes involving magic and monsters.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
That is now available for pre-order in either hardcover, ebook, or audio. It's being published by the Weird Tales Presents imprint of Blackstone Publishing.
How's this going to be different than Dragon Precinct and others?
Dragon Precinct takes place in an epic fantasy setting. That's a sword and sorcery type setting, more J.R.R. Tolkien and George R.R. Martin and that sort of thing. SCU takes place in contemporary New York.
Interesting.
So it's right in my hometown.
Yes.
So yeah, it takes place here in New York and involves a specific division of the NYPD.
Okay, very cool. Peter was self-described as a writer of stuff. Talk maybe your origin story of your Peter David relationship.
It started with me just as a fan of his work. I was very heavily into Marvel Comics in particular in the mid-1980s when his writing career started up, when he started writing for the Spider-Man titles. I was completely blown away by the death of Jean DeWolf's story, which was his first big story that he did for Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man in 1985. I was in high school at the time. And I loved his work on Spider-Man, on the Star Trek comic book, and then I started reading his Star Trek novels. I read his original novels that came out in the late 80s and early 90s, Nightlife, which had King Arthur returning and running for mayor of New York, and Howling Mad, which was about a wolf that's bitten by a werewolf and turns into a human on the night of the full moon.
Yeah.
And then in 1990, right after I graduated college, me and several of my high school and college buddies put together a TV show on public access, which was a thing back then.
Yes.
It was called The Chronic Rift. It was basically a show about geek popular culture.
Yeah, Wayne's World about pop culture, right?
Yeah.
I still have a friend, Sarah Hickman, that did All About Dinosaurs, which was on public access here in Dallas. And she just talked about musicians. She had musicians to guest her. She was a musician. And I got to be on there once. It's
nice.
There when Saturday Night Live used to make fun of cable access. That is something gone. But yes, people old enough can remember that was fun.
Yes, that was what we had before we had YouTube.
Yes, exactly.
And in fact, all the old episodes of The Chronic Rift are now available on YouTube. And so we started out just doing it with friends of ours. We would do news, we would do some reviews, and then the second half of each half-hour episode was a panel discussion on some genre topic or other. We started out just doing it with our friends, and then we started getting in touch with actual professionals.
Yeah, no problem. All right, coming back, I'll cut off you started having panels of discussions.
We would have panel discussions about various pop culture, geek-related subjects. Literature, comic books, TV shows, movies, games, whatever. We were pretty broad-based. Initially, it was just friends of ours coming on, and then eventually we started getting in touch with actual professionals in the field, although we always tried to have at least one non-professional, just somebody who was a fan of the subject matter. Let's try to get a broad range. And then as we were poodling along, we decided we wanted to do an episode on Peter David and see if we could get Peter himself. So we took a shot. We had nothing to lose. And we'd already had Bob Greenberger on, who was the editor of DC Star Trek Comics. as well as Dave Stern, who was the editor of Simon and Schuster. So they both basically vouched to Peter for us to Peter, and so he came on, and that was the first time I met him. We had him on the show. We did a 3-person interview of him. It was nominally a panel discussion of his work, but we usually had 2 hosts and we usually had 3 guests. We only had 2 guests for this one because it was mostly really interviewing Peter. So it
Yeah.
was me, my co-host, and one other person. Judy Fenari was my co-host, and Arenthal V. Hawkins was the other panelist. And we just babbled about his work, which was great. It was a really lively discussion. He was a lot of fun. And we stayed in touch. We had him on. I did a spinoff of the Chronic Rift that only lasted a few episodes called Word Balloons, which was specifically interviews with comic book writers. And one of the episodes I did was an interview with Peter, and then I also did an interview with Chris Claremont, basically because they were 2 of the big mainstream comics
Sure.
at the time. My own career as a writer and editor started taking off. Laura Ann Gilman and I, in 1996, put together an anthology called Otherwhere, which were alternative were-creature stories. One of my first thoughts when we were putting this together was, I got to ask Peter if he wants to do a sequel to Howling Mad,
Sure.
which he did. That closed out the book. That pretty much got the ball rolling of us working together. Once I started publishing Star Trek fiction on a regular basis, we worked together a lot more often.
Yeah.
We both were part of the Gateways crossover in 2001. He wrote the New Frontier segment.
Yeah.
And he wrote stories for me for both the Tales of the Dominion War and Tales from the Captain's Table anthologies that I put together. In both cases, giving me much darker stories than he originally pitched to me. Which was fine. They were both excellent stories. One was supposed to, because the New Frontier books were on a kind of sliding time scale, they realized that each book had taken place after the last one, but was still moving forward in the timeline. The problem was, what it meant was that Dr. Solar's pregnancy took 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he did a graphic novel for Wildstorm, a graphic novel called Double Time, which had them jump forward 18 months in time and wind up in the middle of the Dominion War. And so I asked him to do a story about their arrival. And he wound up giving me this wonderful anti-war piece that focused on Zach Kebron.
Yeah.
We also, one of my first gigs that I had as an editor, when I started working for Byron Price, before my writing career really took off, I was working as an editor for the late Byron Price, and we had a Marvel Comics license. And so we put out a Spider-Man anthology. And Peter actually did 2 pieces for that. He took one of Stan Lee's Spider-Man movie treatments and adapted it into a short story.
Oh, nice.
And then he also wrote a story called 5 Minutes, which was also excellent. And then he wrote a Hulk novel for us called What Savage Beast, which was actually based on a storyline that Marvel wouldn't let him do in the comic books. So that was fun. And then we put together a Hulk anthology, which he did a story for as well. And it went on from there. And we became friends also. We were guests at a lot of the same conventions, including Shore Leave down at the time in Maryland, Farpoint, also in Maryland, and the Icon convention here in New York. Icon was held at Stony Brook University, starting in the late 70s and on into around 2011 was when it pretty much ended due to a variety of ridiculous circumstances. And I think it came back for 1 year in 2017. It was located not far from where Peter lived. So he was almost always a guest at Icon because he could commute.
Yeah, exactly.
And for a while, he would also hold a party at his house that he would invite folks to, which was wonderful. I have many great memories of those parties. He would invite whoever he knew from there. That was how I got to meet Michael O'Hara from Babylon 5. He was New York based. And by that point, he was off B5. He was a guest at Icon 1 year, and we got to talking at his place. Those were always fun. And then later, when I started going to Dragon Con regularly, Peter also used to regularly hold on Sunday nights at Dragon Con. He would invite people for a party in his suite, which would be catered by Fat Matt's Rib Shack. If you have ever been to Atlanta, go to Fat Matt's Rib Shack, unless you're a vegetarian.
Yeah.
But if you like good barbecue, then you will like this. Their ribs are phenomenal. Their fried chicken is phenomenal. And those parties were great. My personal favorite memory from those parties was in 2008.
Okay.
Dragon Con is held over Labor Day weekend. So we were in the throes of a presidential election. At that point, it was Barack Obama and Joe Biden against John McCain and Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin had just been announced as running mate, and we really didn't know what to expect from her yet. And the McCain campaign hadn't quite turned into the Keystone Cops yet, as it did. There was a discussion among myself, Peter, George Takei, Walter Koenig, and Mike Barron, the comics writer. And we were talking about the presidential election. The thing I remember most about that is Peter insisting that there was no way the American people were going to elect a black man president.
Oh, really?
Absolutely no way. I took great pleasure in reminding him that he said that a few months later in November, to which Peter's response was, "I've never been so glad to be wrong in my life."
Yes.
But
I
yeah.
was up at mid in Ohio,
Mhm.
there in I think Columbus, yeah. And I got invited to go to dinner because I knew Tom, and it was that same time frame. And there's Mark Evanier, Tony Isabella, Chris Claremont, just this who's who.
Yeah.
And all they were talking about was the election. Just
Yeah.
that's all they're talking about.
Yeah.
And Tom reached over to me and said, I don't want to hear that. I want to know who do they think should be in the Justice League. And we just kind of laughed. And it was one of those oh crap moments where I'm sitting next to someone and Tom asks, Chris, how's sales going? He goes, everyone brings just the newest stuff to me. No, he says, no one brings my new stuff.
Ah.
Everyone just brings old things to us. And I realized, holy shit, I'm sitting next to Chris Claremont. And I went, just to give you a different side, I said, if I was showing up at your table, I would want to find the oldest, most obscure thing I could have to show you how big of a fan I am. Like, I didn't want to buy the new stuff that I could have just gone, oh, Chris Claremont's here. Let me go buy this and have it signed. And Chris is okay, that's actually, and thank you. That made me feel good. But yeah, every once in a while, Tom and I talk about that, where we just, yep, that just,
That
what
was
is,
always something that's always fun. When I've done a bunch of shows with Peter where we were both were signing books and selling books. We both were a part of Bart's Tower when that was a thing, and a few others. And it was always fun to see some of the weird like stuff people would walk up to him with, pulling out like his old YA books that he wrote under the name David Peters, the
yes.
Photon Adventures, or Soul Searchers and Company, or some other obscure
Yeah.
comic book that is not as well known.
When the first time I was at a convention and got to quote unquote meet him,
Mm.
we were in line and he stood up and he said, okay, I have to go to a panel. Look who's in front of you. Look who's in back of you. We're going to all go walk to my panel. Hopefully, I'm going to entertain you. And then we're all going to come back and everyone remember where you were in line and I'll start signing again.
That
And
sounds very much like Peter.
and I thought that was one genius
Yes.
to just instead of making people like shit, why are you leaving? He made
Yeah.
it really funny. And so sure
Yeah.
enough, everyone's walking and because then, you know, overall, most people aren't jerks, right? So it was kind of, oh, okay, that's the plan. All right. So we go over and he's funny as he always was, right? And then he came back and then we're like, okay, let's start again. Any stories you remember from different conventions? And I'm sure there were tons.
Oh, God, lots. At Shore Leave, he and Bob Greenberger and Michael Jan Friedman did a thing called Mystery Trekky Theater 3000,
Okay.
which was a riff, obviously, on Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Sure.
So they would do an opening skit, which Peter always wrote, and which was always hilarious. And they did all sorts of delightful things. And then they would take a particularly crappy Star Trek episode and make fun of it while silhouetted at the bottom of the thing. And it was absolutely delightful. They finally gave it up. And after a certain point, they were burned out on it because they've been doing it. They
Sure.
started it in, I think, 92 and kept
Wow.
going until the mid to late 2010s. I think like 2017 or 2018 was the last time they did it. And so yeah, it went on for quite some, and they did it every single year. I actually got to participate in that. I was their designated pinch hitter. If either Bob or Mike could not make it, they would ask me to fill in, which was quite an honor and was tremendous fun.
Yeah.
One year, George Takei was one of the big guests at Shore Leave that year. Peter and George are old friends, and Peter co-wrote George's autobiography. They co-wrote some comics together. George was at Peter's wedding, and Peter was at George's wedding. I was only at one of them. I was at Peter's. But George's Q&A was right before Mystery Trekky Theater, his last Q&A that he did at the con. So he did his Q&A, finished it off, and then the three of us come running out and say, wait, George, before you go, we want you to be as part of the opening skit for Mystery Trekky Theater. And George was like, I don't know. No, really, it'll be great. I'm not sure I trust you guys. It's okay. We made a list of possible skits, and we hand him a clipboard. It says, pick one. And George goes through it. No. Oh my. No. And then at one point he starts laughing. He does the George laugh. And he starts laughing. And then we start laughing. And everybody's laughing. And he said, no. This was right after George had been on a very short lived reality show where people would do something other than what they were famous for. In George's case, it was singing country music.
Okay.
This show lasted all of one episode. We asked George, what do you want to do? And he said, I had something planned for the second episode. And so George put on a cowboy hat and sang Patsy Cline's 7 Lonely Days with me, Bob, and Peter as his backup singers slash dancers, at which we were terrible. This is findable on YouTube. Was it Shortly 30 in 2008, I believe.
That is awesome.
So you can find it there, along with that Chronic Rift episode I was talking about. So you can see me as a 21-year-old and Peter when he was still in his 30s. But yeah, that was, of all the Mystery Trekky Theater things, that was probably the best. Unfortunately, what's on YouTube is just the song. It doesn't have the bit before it, which I thought was much funnier. But that was great. And then we went into Mystery Trekky Theater, and of course, everybody who was there for George's Q&A was still sitting there. Like, we had one of the biggest audiences we ever had because we didn't give them any chance to leave. But there was one Icon convention where, for reasons passing understanding, they put together a panel. I don't even remember what the subject of the panel was supposed to be, but It was Peter, me, Scott Edelman, and Harlan Ellison.
Okay.
Which in real terms meant it was Harlan talking for an hour while the three of us just sat there. I honestly think they did this because they knew it would be one panel where me, Peter, and Scott wouldn't be able to get a word in. But yeah, that was just weird. We've done so many conventions together, and he was always great on panels. I've done panels with him. Most of the ones I've done with him have been about Star Trek for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But we've also done panels about writing, about world building, about humor. There's a wonderful panel we did at Dragon Con. It was him, me, Esther Friesner, and I forget the fourth person who was on that panel, but it was specifically on the use of humor in fantasy and science fiction, which Peter excels at, obviously, and so does Esther. Peter was always really good at finding the humor in almost any situation. One of the things he was really good at was conversational humor, particularly. It's one of the reasons why he wrote Spider-Man. So not just jokes, but just the types of humor that you get when people who've known each other for a long time are talking to each other.
Yes.
It made his characters a lot more real.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I found his fiction so enjoyable is it was dialogue heavy and it made it a little easier to read, right? Like sometimes it just kept the story moving around. I did not have as many stories, obviously, but Tom Zoller was staying at my house and I live in Lewisville, Texas, which is in the DFW area. And so we were going to be at like Wizard World or somewhere that was either in Irving or Arlington or something. So Tom had flown down, was going to stay at the house, and I dropped him off with all his stuff for his booth. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go park the car. And okay. And he texted, yeah, you won't believe who we're sitting next to. And it was Peter David. And Peter was to the right. And so we got to talk to him when he wasn't busy all weekend. And it was really a joy because we just got to talk about just normal stuff. I was a little disappointed. I didn't see him and everything. And then I give him credit that he was at another convention here in Dallas. And at the time, I had not watched Babylon 5. And this was right after they had announced that they were going to get season 5 on TNT. Peter was there. And so, of course, I went to a show anytime that Peter's going to talk. And he was in a leather jacket and they said, you look like a Centauri. And he took his hands like this and he made his hair up. And so
J. Michael Straczynski has said on several occasions that he hired Peter because he was already a Centauri.
And so I'm like, okay, if Peter thinks enough of it, I got to go to it. One of the best television experiences of me. Just I enjoyed being immersed in that world. In fact, we just went through a rewatch and enjoyed with two of my friends who had never seen it.
I'm doing a rewatch of Babylon 5 for Reactor Magazine right now. I'm about midway through season 3 at the moment.
Yeah.
Covering everything. I'm going to do Babylon 5. I'm going to do all the movies. I'm going to do Crusade.
Oh, good. I will catch up and read those because that'll be fun. That is really.
I've already covered the 2 episodes that Peter wrote of B5.
Yeah.
Which were very much in keeping with his style. Especially one of the things Peter was really good at was thinking through, okay, if this is the case, what does that really mean? Like one of the best comic book pages he ever wrote was the one where Quicksilver is explaining why he's such a jerk, because the whole world is moving at slow motion to him. And the analogy he uses, imagine you're stuck behind somebody at an ATM who doesn't know how to use it,
Yeah.
and you're frustrated and they're taking forever and you just want to get through them and you just want them to hurry up and finish so you can get there. That's my entire life. That's what everything is like for Quicksilver, is constantly being stuck on the ATM line behind somebody who doesn't know how to use it. And that was just perfect. A
Yeah.
wonderful examination of what life is like for a speedster. In a much more sillier vein, he was like, okay, Delenn has hair for the first time in her life. What does that actually mean? And she's not
Right.
going to have the first damn clue with it. Because the most hair we've seen on the Minbari is a couple of guys who have beards. And the only reason there are a couple of guys who have beards is because the actors weren't willing to shave them for a part.
Yeah.
And that's it as far as hair goes. These are not people who are used to dealing with, certainly not at the amount of hair that Delenn has.
Yeah.
And it was just perfect. And it was
It
exactly the sort of thing Peter was good at.
Yeah, and it did make a great season seeing with Susan and Claudia working with them, and that was some really nice humor and stuff.
Probably the best example of that of his, and I always
Yeah.
like to, he was always big about giving Bill Mantlo credit for getting this started, but because he was the one who established that Bruce Banner was abused as a child. Peter was the one who took that to its logical conclusion, which was the idea that he has what we now call dissociative identity disorder, which completely changed how we looked at the Hulk. And now it's an integral part of any Hulk story now.
Yeah.
No, he
Yeah.
was always very good about making establishing. Yes,
Yeah.
this I only came up with this because Bill Mantlo did a story in which it was
Yeah.
established that he had an abusive dad.
But you come up with something that fundamentally changes how people write a character is pretty impressive.
And yet he was just taking what was already there. He did the same
Yeah.
thing with Aquaman. It was like, okay, this is a guy who can survive the depths of the ocean, and he rules a country. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Christopher Priest did the exact same thing with Black Panther a few years later. And it changed Aquaman from being the joke character into being a force to be reckoned with. It's because of Peter that the idea of Jason Momoa as Aquaman is something that can be taken seriously.
What do you think he was most proud of?
In terms of his work, I'd say
Yeah.
what he was proudest of was the Atlantis Chronicles.
Yeah, I remember reading that
Um,
and was like, gosh,
he
wow.
put and a ton of love into that, and that I I think he would still, however many years later, still view that as one of his greatest accomplishments.
Yeah.
I think certainly his run on the Hulk is one that is pretty much, it's definitive the way Walt Simonson's run on Thor was definitive and the way Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men was definitive.
Yeah.
It's something that will always be an important part of that character. And I'm sure that would be something
You know,
as well.
w-
I know he was very proud of a lot of the original stuff he did.
yeah. And I know that there are people that, Imzadi and the Star Trek novels he wrote,
Yeah.
but I always knew that if Peter David was writing a Star Trek novel, it was going to be good. But I can remember picking up New Frontier. Oh, this is clever. Oh, these are characters that he used in that Young Worf, and oh yeah, look, it's Ashley Judd, and it's all
Yes.
these characters. And I always tell people that have never read them, I said it I don't mean this in a bad way. It's grown up Trek because all the characters change. My partner always jokes at me that I use outdated references, but it's not Bonanza where little Joe gets married, she dies, and the next week no one talks about her. This was there's consequences.
New Frontier grew out of John Ordover, who was one of the editors at Simon & Schuster at the time. John wanted to do a series where he didn't have to hit the reset button. Novels that tie into the original series, any of the TV shows, can't affect serious changes because they have to be consistent with what's on screen. There was a period after that when the novels were given carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. Part of the reason why they allowed the novels to do that was because of what Peter did in New Frontier. One of the reasons why he hired Peter in particular to do it was because his Trek novels were so popular.
Yeah.
Because he was one of the 3 or 4 most highly regarded Star Trek novelists that he got the gig in the first place.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the licensing people at Paramount wrote a 6-page memo explaining why New Frontier could not possibly work. They approved it anyway. They said, take a shot. We'll let you do these first 4 books, these 4 little mini books that were done the exact same way that Stephen King did the Dark Tower books just a couple years earlier, which is part of why they did it. It was a hip new thing in 1997. They said, this is not going to work. The fans are not going to go for this. They're not going to go for a Star Trek novel that is not based on one of the shows. John did it in a popular format at the time. He made sure that both Jean-Luc Picard and Spock were in it because they're the 2 most popular characters in the franchise at the time. And they got one of their most popular writers to do it. And it worked. It sold. It was the best selling thing they did in 1997. And the licensing person said, okay, I was wrong.
That's that
And it's
sounds
worked out
like
great. And it was
yeah,
great for him because it gave him the opportunity to do, because it always frustrated him that he wasn't able to effect real change on the characters,
yeah.
which of course you can't when you're doing. He could at Marvel because he was doing the primary version of the characters. Somebody could come along and change it later, but when he was doing Star Trek fiction, it was derivative fiction, so there were limits on what he could do. And with New Frontier, those limits weren't there, and so that freed him considerably. And I know he had tremendous fun with it.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I love the fact that he wasn't afraid to have 2 captains and they're on different ships. They're married, they're happily married. It's just sometimes your career takes you away.
Yeah,
And I smile at Strange New Worlds because, right, that can happen. The other story I thought of that's not about Peter David, but it's similar. I don't know if you've ever watched the Ken Burns documentary on country music,
I have not.
but there is a scene where this music executive said that when Willie Nelson signed his contract, they gave him complete creative control. So he brought them Redheaded Stranger and they said, this is the demo. And he goes, nope, this is the album. And he said, we can't put this out. That's the album. And so the record company guys, we said, okay, we're going to release this. It will flop. It will sell nothing. And then next time, Willie will listen to us. First million selling album
Right,
of
of
country
course.
music
Yeah,
ever.
yeah,
And they went, okay, maybe we should shut up. Always love it when creative wins.
yeah. Gary Cole's character and Lockley,
Mhm.
Tracy Scoggins' character. It's the same as the dynamic between Calhoun and Shelby.
Yeah.
And once he realized that all he had to do was basically write them as Calhoun and Shelby,
And then change the
script
names.
went beautifully. And this is something that wouldn't really work today. Back in the mists of prehistory, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, people had to hand in manuscripts printed out on pieces of paper. In the mid to late 1990s, when I was working for Byron Price, I would get a floppy disk and a manuscript, both, because novels were too big to send an email at the time. And Peter sent me the manuscript for the Hulk novel, What Savage Beast. And the first, I don't know, 20 pages were just all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy over and over and over again. At the very end, it said, hi, Keith. He said his original plan was to send the entire manuscript like that, but he ran out of printer ink.
If someone has not explored Peter's work, where do you think is a good place to start?
That's the Atlantis Chronicles, I think, is one. I think they finally did put that out, a collection of that out. Took years.
Yeah, I know there was.
There's a bunch of his comic book work that was excellent, and his run on the Hulk was fantastic. His run on X Factor was fantastic. His initial run on Spider-Man 2099 was great. Almost anything.
Yeah.
It depends on what you yourself. People ask me the same question. They ask me like,
Yeah.
"What should I read of yours?" And it's like, it depends on what you like. Both Peter and I have written in a wide variety of genres and types
Yeah.
of things. So it depends on what you like. If you like superheroes, try his superhero stuff. If you like
Yeah.
Star Trek, I definitely would recommend New Frontier. Out of all of his Star Trek work, if you like any of his
Yeah.
Q books,
Yeah.
those were all excellent. And they were very
Yeah.
inspirational to me when I wrote my Q book in 2007.
Yeah.
And particularly his early Next Generation work, but especially New Frontier. One book in
Yeah.
particular, The Once Burned, which was Calhoun's backstory, basically. That was, I think, one of his best. If you're a fan of Star Trek, I recommend a lot of his Star Trek comic book work.
Yes.
Did a bunch
And
of
those are
really good
available.
individual
Yeah.
stories. Yeah. There was I think it was called The Death of Captain Kirk. It was when Kirk was attacked. And it was a story that involved Garth Avizar and Finnegan. And that whole storyline was really well done. There were a couple of annuals he did that were really strong, including one that chronicled Scotty's marriage,
Yeah.
which was beautifully done. There was one issue where Kirk had to eulogize a security guard who nobody knew.
Yeah.
The Scotty thing was inspired by a play called a Harold Pinter play called Betrayal, which was also told backwards, basically. The security guard one was inspired by an old MASH episode where a nurse died and nobody knew her either, and Hawkeye had to eulogize her. But in both cases, it was a very good riff on the existing story
Yeah.
that he made his own.
I remember picking up Tiger Heart
Hmm.
and really feeling, wow, because it was totally not connected to anything. It
Yeah,
wasn't Marvel, it wasn't DC, it wasn't Star Trek, it wasn't Nightlife or anything, right? It
yeah,
was just this, I just felt like telling a new bedtime story.
yeah,
And it's his version of Peter Pan,
yeah.
and it's just a lovely book.
I really enjoyed one of his original things that I think he did for Amazon. It was called Artful, which was the Artful Dodgers story,
Yes.
which I thought was excellent because he was really the most interesting character in Oliver Twist.
Yeah. I know you can't speak for him, but what do you think he wanted to do that he didn't get to do?
Oh God, there were probably a lot of things, some of which he talked about. I think he would have liked his original stuff to have reached a wider audience. Certainly, if he certainly would have loved it if one of his original stuff got spun off into a movie or a TV show, which did not happen in his lifetime. We all want that. I know he was never entirely satisfied. He always felt his stuff could have reached more people or been more popular or been more successful,
Yeah.
which was both good and bad. I think he didn't give himself nearly enough credit, but there's also something to be said for wanting to do better
Yeah.
and always pushing himself to do better.
I can't remember where I read, but there was an interview where he talked about how much he loved the Phantom and
Yes.
how he felt the Phantom was the perfect character because the generations, whatever story you want to tell, you want to do a Western? Great. You want to do a pirate story? Great. You want to do a romance? Great. It's there.
And he did get to write the Phantom. So,
Yes, he did. I really enjoyed it.
yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. The other thing that I really, when I think of him, I think of his But I Digress column.
Yes.
That was a highlight of Comic Buyer's Guide. Go to the last page right away.
Yeah, I did that.
I wish I could find a copy, and it might be, I think I have a collection of them, but I don't remember if it was there. But he once did a column about how readers will forgive you if you wink at it. Rick Jones saying, "Oh, I always keep I always wear a parachute because you never know," or something
And yeah, with Rick Jones, you can get away with that.
where he talked about, and sometimes if you can wink at the audience and go, "Yeah, I know I'm being ridiculous, but hey,
Yeah,
you guys want a happy story? I'm trying to give you a happy story."
yeah.
Any other final thoughts before I let you go?
Oh God, there are two people who have become very important in my life, both very close friends. One of more than 30 years, one of only 6 years. Sorry, math is hard, but both of them are two of the most very important people in my life. And I met both of them because of Peter. One I met just because I went to a convention Peter was at, and I met the other person who was also at the table, and we started talking, and we haven't shut up since. and, and the other one was somebody I met at one of the Dragon Con parties.
Yeah.
That both Glenn and Tony Ann are part of my life because of Peter.
Yeah.
And I really regret that I never act because I didn't really realize that until after he died. It was like when I
Yeah.
was sitting down and writing because I wrote a blog post remembering all sorts of memories I have with Peter, some of which I have shared with you tonight. And I didn't realize that. Like it never really connected in my head until then. And I'm annoyed that I didn't get to tell him that before he died.
Yeah.
But I also am incredibly grateful to him for all the wonderful entertainment he gave me over the last 40 years. From the death of Gene the Wolf all the way through to the Phenomenon's shared world anthologies that he and I have been doing with Michael Jan Friedman over the last couple of years. He did one of the last stories he did was plotting out the story for the third one that he did for his Professor Paracelsus character, who is a really good character.
Yeah. I think there is a legacy of so much great work and so much. I know for a while, especially during the first Trump administration, he was speaking truth to power.
His blog basically took over from But I Digress, and it was the last few years of it were entirely his Freak Out Friday pieces, which were entirely about the mendacity of the Trump administration. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I remember one of his early Patreon stories was this short story about someone like Trump being elected. And that was a very entertaining short story. Keith, thank you for taking time to do this. I
Oh, my pleasure.
appreciate it so much. If someone wants to reach you and tell us how, and also promote what's coming up.
I already mentioned the big thing that's coming up, which is the Supernatural Crimes Unit book, which is available for pre-order. If you just search for Supernatural Crimes Unit on whatever your online book dealer of choice is, you will find it. It's up. It'll be out in hardcover, ebook, and audio from the Weird Tales Presents imprint of Blackstone. If you want to find me online, search for Keith DeCandido. I'm the only thing that's going to turn up. There is nobody else with that name. I am on Facebook. I am on Threads. I am on Instagram. I'm on TikTok. I am on Blue Sky. I have a Patreon. I'm still somewhat on Twitter, whatever it's called. And I have a YouTube channel, but it's on hiatus at the moment. But if you want
Okay.
to see me reading some of my short stories, you can find that there. I'm on Reactor. My Babylon 5 rewatch happens every Monday at Reactor Magazine, which is reactormag.com. And I also review all the new Star Trek shows. So when the new season of Stranger Worlds debuts, for that matter, when the Starfleet Academy shows debuts, and whenever any other new Star Trek shows show up, I will be writing about it there. Plus my periodic revival of the Great Superhero Movie Rewatch, which will happen at the end of the year, where I'll look at the movies that have come out for the last year in that genre.
Very nice.
And I've also got the next issue of Weird Tales magazine. Actually, the next two issues of Weird Tales magazine. I'm going to have a story in each of those,
Very nice.
which is that was a bucket list item for me. I've been a Weird Tales fan for since I was a kid, and having two stories in the magazine is just like a thrill beyond all possible imagining. I also have a blog because I'm old and I update it fairly regularly. If you follow me at any of the places where I am online, you can find out what I'm up to and where you can find me and when stuff is coming out. I forgot to mention, we had the first. My wife and I put together an anthology for our small press called "The Four Somethings of the Apocalypse," and Peter had a story in that too. Oh, I do want to mention one other thing. There's an anthology coming out this year called "The Green Hornet and Kato: Detroit Noir City." This is another bucket list item. I got to write a Green Hornet and Kato story, and it is entitled "Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting" because I
That
had to do it.
you had to.
The anthology also has stories by Kevin J. Anderson and Timothy Zahn and Mary Phan and Bill Willingham and a bunch of other people who I can't remember right now.
Yeah.
But Megan Mackey is in there, Smiko Salson, and I'm forgetting who else. But David Boop edited it, and it's a really good anthology, and that'll be out from Moonstone Books sometime this summer.
All right, Keith, let's get together soon. I appreciate you, my friend.
Mhm.
Listeners, I'm going to include some links in the show notes. I'm going to include some links to some of Peter's work. You will enjoy it very much. No matter what your taste in fiction or nonfiction, you will find something. So for now, be safe, be kind. We'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. Thank you, Keith. This was
No
perfect.
problem.
I appreciate it.
I forgot to mention it.
Thank you, buddy. We'll talk to you soon.
Take
Appreciate you.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye.